The Silent Observer. It was an ordinary Thursday morning in downtown New York City, but for Emily Dawson, the events that would unfold at SpinTech would change everything. The bustling city skyline reflected the hopes and dreams of millions, yet behind the glittering glass walls of SpinTech, one woman's secret power was about to come to light. Emily Dawson had once been the proud and accomplished CEO of SpinTech, a leading tech company known for its groundbreaking innovations and cutting-edge software. Yet today, she was dressed in the humble uniform of a cleaner, pushing a cleaning cart through the sleek, marble-lined hallways of the very company she had built. Her once professional attire had been traded for a simple blue shirt, black pants, and sneakers. Her dark brown hair, usually styled with elegance and authority, was pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. No one could have guessed that the woman silently scrubbing the floors and wiping down desks was, in fact, the heart and soul of the empire that housed the sleek offices of SpinTech. She moved deliberately from one corner of the building to the next, methodically going about her work, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She wasn't here because she had fallen on hard times, nor was she interested in working for a paycheck. She had one goal: to observe. The truth behind the scenes of SpinTech needed to be uncovered. Emily needed to know what was happening in the company she had spent years building, a company that had turned from a humble startup into one of the most valuable tech firms in the world. To most of the employees at SpinTech, Emily was nothing more than an invisible figure, someone to be ignored, someone whose presence was barely acknowledged. The higher-ups, especially Jeff Matthews, the so-called acting CEO, seemed to have forgotten that the cleaner in the hallway had once been their leader. The irony of the situation was not lost on Emily, but she wasn't here to seek revenge. No, she was here for something much more important: justice. SpinTech had once been a company driven by values, innovation, integrity, and fairness. But that had all changed in recent years. Jeff Matthews had clawed his way to the top by leveraging manipulation and underhanded tactics, all while hiding behind his polished suit and polished smile. He had become a master at playing politics, using his charm to manipulate board members and get what he wanted. He was the one who now held the title of acting CEO, even though his qualifications were, at best, dubious. Emily had entrusted her company to her older brother, Paul Dawson, when she had decided to step down from the CEO position. Paul was a brilliant strategist, but he lacked the passion and drive that Emily had. Still, he was trustworthy, and Emily had hoped that he would keep SpinTech on the right path. But the company's fortunes had begun to slip away from its once innovative roots. Under Jeff's leadership, SpinTech's core values had crumbled, and employees were beginning to feel the effects. The management team had grown complacent, indifferent to the people who made the company run. The hard-working employees who worked long hours in the trenches were treated as little more than disposable resources. They were invisible to the higher-ups, especially to Jeff Matthews. It didn't take long for Emily to realize the extent of the damage. Jeff Matthews had turned SpinTech into his personal playground, and those who dared to challenge him found themselves quickly dismissed. Emily had been quietly observing for weeks, careful not to reveal her true identity. She was patient, learning everything she could about the company's inner workings and the people who were running it into the ground. And there was no shortage of arrogance and disregard for others. Jeff Matthews, in particular, stood out for his treatment of employees. His behavior was both appalling and unpredictable. Emily had witnessed his cruel treatment of junior staff members, belittling them with cutting remarks and demeaning comments. He would wander the halls, pausing to make condescending remarks to the cleaners, as though they were beneath him. One day, he had made a snide remark as he passed Emily in the hallway. "You missed a spot," he had said, pointing to a spot on the floor that was already immaculate. Emily had smiled politely, not allowing his taunt to provoke her. But inside, her blood had boiled. This man had no idea who she was. The weeks went by, and Emily continued to observe, always with a quiet determination. She spent her days cleaning and her evenings on the phone with Paul, discussing the state of the company. Paul was frustrated too, but Emily remained calm. She knew the time wasn't right yet. She needed more information, more proof of the corruption at the heart of SpinTech before making her move. One evening, during one of their routine check-ins, Emily had confided in Paul. "It's worse than I thought," she admitted. "Jeff is driving this company into the ground. He's mismanaging everything, and the employees are getting fed up. But I can't act just yet. I need to be sure of who's really worth keeping and who needs to go." Paul was supportive, as always. "Take your time, Emily," he told her. "When you make your move, they won't see it coming." Emily's resolve grew stronger as the days passed. She was watching Jeff closely now, observing his every move, his every word. He had become increasingly bolder in his treatment of the staff, and his arrogance was beginning to show cracks. His inappropriate comments to Emily were becoming more frequent, and his attempts to intimidate her were more overt. One day, as she was cleaning the break room, Jeff cornered her. "You know, you could make your life a lot easier if you'd just be more cooperative," he said with a grin that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "If you played your cards right, maybe I could find you a better job. Maybe something more glamorous." Emily had stood tall, not allowing his words to rattle her. She knew exactly who she was, and she wasn't about to let Jeff Matthews degrade her any further. But his threats had continued to escalate. "If you don't play along, I'll make sure you're out of here before the week is over," he had warned her one evening, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "And believe me, no one else will hire someone like you." In that moment, something inside Emily snapped. She knew she had to act. She had been patient for long enough. The time had come to reveal the truth, to show everyone that the woman they had been treating like dirt was, in fact, the very person who held the power to change their entire future. The following morning, Emily walked into SpinTech, not as the cleaner, but as the force to be reckoned with. She was no longer the silent observer. Today, she would make sure Jeff Matthews and the rest of the arrogant management team learned a lesson they would never forget. The unseen power. The next day dawned with a subtle but powerful shift in the air. Emily Dawson, dressed in a sharp white blazer and black pants, no longer resembled the quiet cleaner who had mopped floors and dusted desks for the past few weeks. She had shed her disguise and was ready to face the storm that was coming. The world she had once ruled, a world where she had built SpinTech from the ground up, was about to witness a new kind of power, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but simply demands respect. As she stepped into the lobby of SpinTech, Emily was met with the usual bustle. The employees were moving quickly, heading to their offices with their eyes fixed on their phones or on the looming deadlines that dictated their lives. They barely glanced at her, still unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. But today, Emily wasn't invisible. Her presence cut through the noise like a blade, and as she walked through the corridors, something in the air seemed to shift. She had carefully planned her entrance. No one in the building was prepared for what was about to unfold, least of all Jeff Matthews. Emily's heels clicked with purpose as she walked toward the elevator, her posture straight, her face calm. She had practiced this moment in her mind for weeks, running through the steps in her head, visualizing the reactions, the expressions, the shock. She knew that her return to the office wasn't going to be welcomed. After all, she had relinquished control of SpinTech to her brother, Paul, and kept a low profile for years. Most of the employees, particularly those in management, had long since forgotten that Emily was the woman who had founded the company, the woman who had poured her soul into it. As Emily entered the elevator, she glanced at her reflection in the polished metal doors. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, but beneath the surface, she could feel the tension building. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Her mind was focused, but her heart raced. Emily wasn't just going to confront Jeff Matthews. She was going to take back control of her company, her legacy, and prove that those who had underestimated her would soon realize the error of their ways. The elevator doors opened on the top floor, and Emily walked with confidence down the hallway toward the boardroom. The employees who were near the conference rooms were the first to notice her. Their eyes widened as they saw her, and a ripple of whispers followed her steps. "Who's that?" one of them murmured to the other. "I've never seen her before." It wasn't surprising. Emily had been a shadow in her own company for so long, kept out of sight by her brother Paul's decision to step into the CEO role. But today, she wasn't here to blend into the background. Today, she would take center stage. The boardroom doors were open, and inside, the management team was preparing for their usual meeting. They were talking amongst themselves, discussing quarterly projections and the latest financial moves. But the room fell silent when they saw Emily enter. Jeff Matthews was the first to stand, his expression one of mild confusion. He glanced at her, then back at the others, clearly unsure of who this woman was or why she had such a commanding presence. He had never seen her before in the context of this role, of course, and she didn't look anything like the cleaner he had humiliated in the past. "Can I help you?" Jeff's voice was smooth, carrying a sense of superiority that he had cultivated over the years. He looked at her with a raised eyebrow, sizing her up as if she were just another person who didn't belong in his world. Emily took a deep breath, allowing the silence to hang in the air for just a moment. It was important to let the tension build. Let them wonder. Let them feel the weight of her presence. Then, with a smile that was polite but firm, she spoke. "I believe you can," she said calmly, her voice carrying with quiet authority. "I'm here to discuss something very important with all of you." For a moment, Jeff Matthews didn't respond. His brow furrowed, and he glanced at his colleagues, who were also staring at Emily, trying to make sense of the situation. Emily's eyes briefly scanned the room, taking in the faces of the people who had been running SpinTech into the ground, who had shown such utter disregard for the company's integrity, and who had made her feel like an outsider in her own business. One by one, she noticed their discomfort. Miss Theobald, the head of marketing, shifted in her seat, adjusting her glasses as if trying to figure out whether she recognized this woman. Mr. Carter, the head of finance, straightened his tie, suddenly nervous. It was as if the room had shifted on its axis, and they were unsure whether to challenge this intruder or to wait for further explanation. Emily didn't waste any more time. She was done with the theatrics. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "I've been watching," she continued, her voice now carrying the hint of steel. "For the past few weeks, I've been observing everything that's been going on here at SpinTech. The way this company has been run, the way employees have been treated, especially the cleaners, the ones who work the hardest but are treated the worst." Jeff Matthews opened his mouth to say something, but Emily silenced him with a raised hand. She had the floor now. "As I'm sure you're all aware," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room, "I am Emily Dawson, and I built this company. I founded SpinTech. Everything that has been achieved here, all the success, was because of my vision, my work, my sacrifice." The room was dead silent now, the realization hitting them all at once. The woman they had dismissed as a mere cleaner, the woman they had underestimated, degraded, and humiliated, was the founder of the very company they were all trying to control. Jeff Matthews, who had once dared to belittle her, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. He sputtered, trying to recover, but the damage was already done. "Wait, what?" he stammered. "You can't be." Emily held up the folder. "I've also been gathering evidence of your actions, Jeff. Your treatment of the employees, your mismanagement of resources, your inappropriate behavior toward staff members. I'm sure the board would love to see the records I've compiled." There was no denying it now. The power was in her hands. She wasn't just Emily Dawson, the cleaner. She was Emily Dawson, the force that had built SpinTech from nothing. And now she was reclaiming what was rightfully hers. With a steady gaze, she addressed the entire room. "As of today, I am once again the CEO of SpinTech, and I expect all of you to follow the principles this company was founded on. There will be changes. There will be consequences. And Jeff, as for you, your time at SpinTech is over." The shock was palpable. The room was frozen in disbelief as Emily's words sunk in. No one had expected this. Certainly not Jeff Matthews. Certainly not any of them. They had all underestimated the woman who had been quietly observing them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. The reckoning begins. The weight of Emily's words hung heavily in the air, but the tension in the room was electric. Jeff Matthews stood frozen, his posture rigid, as though his body had suddenly forgotten how to move. He opened his mouth several times to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His face, once adorned with a smug smirk, was now pale, as if he had suddenly realized that the charade was over. His grip tightened around the edge of the boardroom table, his knuckles white, but still, he couldn't form a coherent response. Emily stood tall at the head of the table, her gaze unwavering. The management team, who had been complicit in Jeff's leadership, looked between each other, some in shock, others in disbelief. It was clear that no one had expected Emily Dawson, the former CEO they had all forgotten, or more likely, never respected, to reappear in such a commanding role. And certainly, none of them had anticipated the storm of retribution she was about to unleash. "You can't just come in here and take control like this." Jeff finally managed to sputter, his voice rising, desperation creeping into his tone. "You gave up your position years ago. Paul is the CEO now. This is his company. You have no say in what happens here." Emily's smile remained steady, but there was an underlying sharpness in her eyes. "I might not have been here for the day-to-day operations in recent years, Jeff, but make no mistake, I built this company. I'm the reason you have a job. And if anyone is going to ruin it, it won't be you or anyone else in this room. This company was founded on a set of principles that you've long since forgotten: integrity, respect, and hard work. And you," she said, her gaze narrowing on Jeff, "have disrespected everything this company stands for." The other members of the management team shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared to speak. Emily's words had struck a chord with them. Deep down, they all knew that the way things had been running at SpinTech was unsustainable. They had turned a blind eye to Jeff's tyrannical rule because it suited them in the short term, but the cracks had been showing for a long time. "Well, I'm still the acting CEO," Jeff continued, his voice now tinged with panic. "And you can't just waltz in here and take my position. I'll have you removed. You'll see." Emily raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "You don't seem to understand, Jeff. I'm not taking your position. You've already forfeited it. You've been in charge of SpinTech for far too long, and under your leadership, this company has lost its way. The board, at least the ones who still care about the company's future, know this. Today, we're going to take a good hard look at SpinTech's future." Her voice was calm, measured, but there was an undeniable authority behind it. She wasn't speaking to Jeff alone. She was addressing the entire room. Slowly, she opened the manila folder she had brought with her, and with deliberate movements, she began to lay out the evidence she had gathered over the past weeks. The room was still, every eye fixed on her as she placed document after document on the table in front of her. "These," Emily began, her voice soft but firm, "are just a few examples of the damage you've caused. Mismanagement of funds, abuse of power, inappropriate conduct, and worst of all, the mistreatment of employees. SpinTech's reputation is on the line, and it's your actions, Jeff, that have put it in jeopardy." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The employees, the ones who had been silently observing the situation from the corners of the room, began to whisper among themselves. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others seemed to nod in agreement. This wasn't just a moment for the management team. This was a turning point for everyone at SpinTech. Jeff's face was growing redder by the second, but he still tried to maintain his composure. "These are just accusations, Emily. Nothing you've shown proves anything. You can't just walk in here and turn everything upside down." "I don't need to prove anything to you, Jeff," Emily replied, her tone turning cold. "You've already proven everything with your actions. The fact that you think you can continue to intimidate and control people in this building shows how out of touch you are, but we're going to fix that. Today." Emily turned to the rest of the management team, her eyes sweeping over them. "The truth is, many of you are complicit in Jeff's actions. Some of you have turned a blind eye to the abuse, the exploitation, the corporate greed. But I've seen enough, and I'm sure the board has too. This is not the company I built. This is not the company I intended to leave behind." The silence in the room was deafening. Emily's words were cutting through the facade that Jeff had built around SpinTech, and there was no denying the truth. The board members, who had previously remained silent, were now looking uncomfortable. Emily could sense their unease, and she knew this was her moment. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to take charge, to show them who she truly was, and what she could do when she took control. "You can either be part of the solution or part of the problem," Emily said, her eyes locking with each of the board members in turn. "Those of you who truly care about the future of SpinTech will stand with me. Those who don't will be shown the door." For a moment, it seemed like nothing was going to happen. Then, one by one, the board members began to shift in their seats, their discomfort now visible. Emily knew that some of them had been biding their time, waiting for a leader to step forward, someone who would restore the values they had once believed in. She wasn't just giving them the opportunity to act. She was forcing them to make a choice. Jeff Matthews, who had been trying to muster a response, suddenly realized that the tide had turned. His eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but none of the board members met his gaze. His reign of power was coming to an end, and he knew it. But he couldn't go down without a fight. "You can't do this, Emily," Jeff spat, his voice growing shrill. "You're nothing but a—" "Enough," Emily cut him off, her voice cold as ice. "You've had your chance, Jeff. And now, you're done." Without waiting for a response, Emily turned to the head of the board, an older man named Richard Dalton. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and observant. Emily had always respected him for his insight into the company's long-term goals, even though he had often stayed on the sidelines during Jeff's rule. Now, it was his time to make a choice. "Richard," Emily said, addressing him directly, "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation. You've been a part of SpinTech since the beginning. What do you think?" Richard's eyes narrowed for a moment as he processed her words. Then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I think it's time for a change," he said quietly. And with those words, the final domino fell. The room, which had been so tense only moments before, suddenly shifted in a way that Emily hadn't expected. Some of the board members were now looking at Jeff with disdain, their loyalty to him fading quickly in the face of Emily's unyielding resolve. Jeff's face drained of color as he realized that the very foundation of his power had crumbled in an instant. His reign was over, and Emily Dawson, the woman he had once humiliated and dismissed, was once again in control. The room was still for a moment, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. But Emily knew that the next steps were clear. SpinTech was hers again, and this time, nothing and no one would stand in her way. The shifting of the guard, the tension that had hung in the air like a thick fog, slowly began to dissipate, but the transformation in the room was far from over. Emily stood at the helm, her demeanor cool and composed, while Jeff Matthews, formerly the man who had bullied his way to the top, now appeared a shadow of his former self. His arrogance had dissolved, and in its place was the stark reality of his downfall. The power dynamic in the boardroom had shifted in a way no one had anticipated. Emily Dawson was once again in control, but this wasn't about taking revenge. It was about rebuilding, restoring, and ensuring that SpinTech returned to the principles it was founded on. Richard Dalton, the board member who had quietly supported Emily's actions, stood up slowly from his chair. He was a man of few words, but his nod of approval spoke volumes. The others followed suit, one by one, each offering a silent but unmistakable show of solidarity. "Let's move forward," Emily said, her voice firm but calm, breaking the stillness that had filled the room. "We need to focus on what happens next. This isn't just about removing Jeff or cleaning up his mess. It's about setting SpinTech on a path to reclaim the integrity and values that made it great in the first place." There was a murmur of agreement, but Jeff remained silent, his face contorted in disbelief. His mind was racing, but he couldn't find the words to fight back. The reality of his position, once so secure, was slipping through his fingers like sand. And it wasn't just the loss of his position that was hurting him. It was the bitter taste of being outmaneuvered by someone he had seen as insignificant. "You can't just do this," Jeff finally managed, his voice low and trembling. "I've worked my way up. I've built relationships. I have leverage." Emily raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his attempts to maintain his hold on the room. "Leverage?" she asked, her voice thick with irony. "Jeff, the only leverage you had was the exploitation of people beneath you, the employees you belittled and manipulated to feed your own ego. That's not leverage. That's weakness." She glanced at the board members. "This company was built on the sweat of its employees, the innovations we created, and the partnerships we nurtured. What you did, Jeff, was burn those bridges. And now we're here to rebuild them. Together." The board members looked around at each other, their collective discomfort shifting into a quiet, unified resolve. There was no going back now. They had made their decision. They had chosen Emily. Jeff's lips twisted into a grimace, and for the first time, he realized that his position was no longer his to defend. His eyes flickered toward the door, then back at Emily, who had not once wavered in her composure. "You think you can just walk back in and fix everything?" Jeff sneered. "You don't understand how this company works now. It's not about ideals. It's about making money. And I'm the one who knows how to make this place profitable." Emily didn't even blink at his words. "Profit without integrity is fleeting, Jeff. You might have driven numbers up in the short term, but you've poisoned the company's soul. SpinTech isn't just a business, it's a community. And right now, it needs someone who cares about more than just the bottom line. It needs someone who values the people who made it possible in the first place. I've been in the trenches. I know what it takes to build something lasting." The room was now electric, with a palpable energy. The board members, many of whom had been on the sidelines as Jeff's abuses unfolded, were beginning to stir, shifting in their seats as if they were waking from a long, uncomfortable slumber. "I'll give you a chance," Richard Dalton said quietly. His voice carried the weight of experience and a deep understanding of the company's history. "But it's not just about what's happened here. It's about what happens next. How do we move forward?" Emily nodded, turning her gaze to the board. "Moving forward means restoring faith in SpinTech. It means leading with empathy, transparency, and the values that made this company a trailblazer in the tech industry. It's not just about revenue. It's about creating an environment where innovation thrives, where employees are respected, and where we can stand proud knowing that we're contributing something valuable to the world." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the board members, who had long been disillusioned by Jeff's self-serving leadership. Emily's vision was clear, and it was one that aligned with the values that had driven SpinTech from its very beginning. It was a vision that could turn the company around, rebuild its reputation, and bring it back to its roots. "I'll start by addressing the most pressing issues," Emily continued. "First, we need to clean house. Jeff, you're fired. Your behavior, your actions, everything you've done here, it's unacceptable. You're no longer welcome at SpinTech." There was no surprise in the room. The board members had already made their decision, and it was one they knew was long overdue. The question now was what would happen next. Jeff's face flushed with anger. "You can't just fire me," he shouted. "I've made deals. I've brought in investors. You've damaged relationships, Jeff," Emily interrupted, her tone icy. "You've burned bridges with clients, with staff, and with investors. You're toxic to this company, and the time for your games is over." As Emily spoke, the board members nodded, one after another, confirming their agreement. There was no turning back. Jeff had crossed the line too many times, and the consequences were now inescapable. Jeff opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips. He had no power here anymore. The room had shifted, and he had been left behind. Slowly, he stood up from his seat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His eyes flashed with rage, but even that wasn't enough to change the course of events. He had been unmasked as a fraud, and there was nothing he could do to salvage his position. "I'll be taking my leave," Jeff said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "But mark my words, Emily, this company will fall without me. You'll regret this." Emily watched him silently as he gathered his belongings and left the room. There was no drama, no spectacle, just the quiet, inevitable departure of someone who had overstayed their welcome. As the door closed behind Jeff, Emily turned to face the board. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about removing one toxic individual. It was about the future of SpinTech. It was about restoring a sense of purpose and direction to a company that had lost its way. Emily had taken the first step toward that transformation, and she wasn't about to stop now. "It's time to rebuild," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll start with our people. We'll bring in the best talent, and we'll ensure that everyone at SpinTech knows they are valued. The first thing we'll do is restore trust. We'll take responsibility for our mistakes and make it clear that we are moving forward with integrity." The board members exchanged looks, some of them nodding in agreement. Richard Dalton, who had remained quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "I think we all know what we need to do," he said. "We've been sitting on the sidelines for too long. It's time to act." Emily smiled. "Exactly. It's time to act." With that, the board began discussing the next steps. There were plans to announce Jeff's departure, restore employee morale, and begin rebuilding the company's image. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road Emily was prepared to walk. SpinTech had fallen off course, but now, with Emily at the helm once again, the company would rise anew, stronger, more focused, and more committed to its founding values than ever before. And this time, there would be no looking back.